Imagine waiting, like, over 10 years for, essential care for someone you love.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking, and it's the reality for a lot of Texas families dealing with this mess, really, this collapsing disability care system. And today we're going deep on, why this is happening and what's at stake.
Yeah, it's really complicated. It kind of goes back to this shift from those big institutions to more community-based care.
Yeah.
Good idea in theory, right?
Right.
But the system, the funding, everything, it just hasn't kept up.
Okay, so Texas decided to move away from these large institutions in favor of care within communities, and I think that, that sounds like a good thing on the surface. Right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely more humane, more inclusive. The problem is the funding, the staffing, the whole support structure hasn't really kept pace with that shift.
And that brings us to, like, the core of this whole thing. The direct support professionals, we'll call them DSPs for short, these are the folks who are, on the ground, providing that direct care to folks with disabilities.
Exactly. They're juggling, we're talking multiple people, many with, complex medical needs, and they're working crazy hours, like 60, 100 hours a week sometimes.
Oh, wow.
And for that, they're making, get this, $10.60 an hour.
You're kidding. That's barely more than minimum wage. I make more than that, like serving coffee. You're kidding me. For that kind of work.
It's a huge problem because obviously that kind of wage leads to a revolving door of staff. The Austin American-Statesman, they reported a 34% vacancy rate for DSPs just last year. In 2024, think about that. Almost half of all the group homes in Texas are short-staffed.
Wow. Yeah, that's a crazy number. No wonder these facilities are shutting down.
Exactly. Between January 2023 and February 2024, 179 home and community-based services homes and 50 intermediate care facilities closed. So sadly, what happens is these individuals, they end up back in institutions, and not because it's the ideal situation, but because there's just literally nowhere else for them to go.
Wow, that's just awful. It's like, it's good on paper, but in practice, it's failing. And speaking of systems that sound good on paper but are failing in practice, let's talk about the Medicaid waiver system here in Texas. It's supposed to be like a safety net, right? But it seems like, from what we're hearing, families are stuck navigating this bureaucratic maze.
Yeah, no, you're right. So the idea with Medicaid waivers is to help people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we'll call it IDD, to receive care in their communities. But you're right, it's so complex.
So we're talking 6 different waiver programs, right? Each with its own set of rules and regulations.
Yeah, you got it.
That just sounds incredibly hard to navigate.
It is. And the wait times are unbelievable. Like, try to imagine being on a waiting list for over 16 years.
16 years.
Only to pass away before you even get the services that you desperately need. And sadly, that's not a hypothetical, it's a reality for some families.
That's just devastating. There have been some really incredible pieces of investigative journalism that have exposed these failures, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
The Austin American-Statesman did a series called Disabled and Abandoned, and the Dallas Morning News had Pain and Profit. Both of them really expose the cracks in the system. Stories of neglect, understaffing, just inadequate care are unfortunately everywhere.
It makes you angry to think that a system designed to help people, vulnerable people, could be, so messed up. We mentioned that Dallas Morning News series, Pain and Profit, earlier, and kind of makes you wonder, are some groups benefiting from this broken system? Is that what we're seeing here?
So that Pain and Profit series, it really dug into those financial incentives in the system. And yeah, what it found was that some large private Medicaid providers, they've gotten really good at working within the existing structure, even if that structure, like we've been talking about, isn't really serving the people it's supposed to.
So you're saying these companies, they're putting profits over people. They don't want change because it might hurt their bottom line.
Well, it's not always that simple. These companies, they're operating within a bigger system, right, with all these other issues. But yeah, it's important to remember that, when money's involved, it could definitely slow things down and even prevent support for reforms that, could change things up.
That makes sense, but it's still, it's disheartening for sure. How are these groups influencing these policy decisions? Are we talking about, lobbyists?
Lobbying is a huge part of it, for sure. These companies, they hire professional lobbyists to, go to bat for them and build relationships with these lawmakers. They give them information, sometimes even try to sway their opinions on legislation that might, affect how they operate.
So it's about, like, access, having their voices heard by the people in charge. But shouldn't these lawmakers, like, shouldn't they be looking out for what's best for everybody, even if it goes against what these powerful groups want?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they have a responsibility to look at all sides and make choices that benefit everybody, the
Right.
greater good, right? And even though this financial influence exists, a lot of these lawmakers, they really are committed to finding solutions, to making things better for their constituents.
Well, it's good to hear. Are there any, like, specific examples of legislation that have been impacted by this lobbying?
Well, there was a bill a couple of years ago, House Bill 3659. It was actually, believe it or not, it had support from both sides of the aisle, and it was aimed at streamlining the Medicaid waiver services and, like, reducing those crazy long wait times we talked about. It seemed like common sense, right?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it stalled in the legislature. It never went anywhere.
So a bill that would make things, like, easier, more user-friendly, it gets stuck. I mean, it really makes you wonder if those lobbyists had something to do with it.
It's hard to say for sure, what the one single cause was, but a lot of people who, they follow this issue closely, they think that, some powerful groups who wanted to keep things the way they are, they definitely worked against that bill.
Man, that's really discouraging. But let's shift gears just a little bit. We've talked a lot about, the system itself and these big issues, but we got to remember that this crisis, it affects real people, There are families behind these numbers who are going through some really tough times.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Like, to really get it, to understand the impact of this, we got to hear from the people who are living it every day.
And we've got a couple of those stories to share today, right?
Who do?
Real stories that remind us why this is such a big deal.
Yeah, and they're tough, these stories, but they really show us the human cost of a system that's failing.
Well, let's hear them. Who are we talking about?
We'll start with Sandra Adams. She's a mom, 2 kids, both with IBD.
Okay, so tell us about Sandra and her family. What have they been dealing with?
Sandra spent 11 years on the wait list for Medicaid waiver services for her kids. Just imagine that, like, just living with that uncertainty, that weight, that constant struggle to, get your kids the care they need.
11 years that's unbelievable. I can't imagine how stressful that must be, how frustrating for families.
It's incredibly difficult. And for Sandra, it wasn't just the wait list. I mean, to make ends meet, they actually had to sell their home. They had to move into a smaller apartment.
Man, it just shows you how this crisis just kind of, like, ripples out, right? It's not just about, like, getting services. It's about being able to keep a roof over your head, about being financially secure. It affects the whole family.
Exactly. You hit it right there. And unfortunately, Sandra's story is not unique. There are so many families out there facing these same challenges, having to make, unthinkable sacrifices, all while dealing with a system that feels like it's working against them.
It's heartbreaking, honestly. It makes you think, like, if this is what it's like for families who actually get services, what about the ones who don't?
Yeah, that's a question we have to ask. Because for some people that wait for help, it has even worse consequences. Take Paul Richards, for instance. He's a 35-year-old man with autism.
Okay, so tell us about Paul. What happened? So Paul, he finally gets placed in a group home after 8 years. 8 years on a wait list. You'd think that'd be a good thing, right? Like, he's finally going to get the care he needs.
You would think so. It should have been.
Yeah.
But the group home, totally understaffed. And it goes back to what we were talking about, those low wages.
Right.
DSPs making $10.60 an hour. So places like this, they can't keep staff. They're running on fumes, and it puts the residents at risk.
And that's what happened with Paul, right? Like, this understaffing, it had real consequences.
Yeah, it did. Paul, he wandered away from the group home. He was gone for hours, ended up miles away, dehydrated.
Yeah.
You can imagine how scary that was, how traumatic for him and his family.
Oh, absolutely.
His mom, she eventually found him, but still, I mean, that kind of thing, it stays with you.
Man. It's a reminder that this isn't just about, like, politics or budgets. It's about real people's lives. People who deserve to be cared for, to have a chance to thrive.
Right, exactly. Sandra, Paul, their stories, they show just how urgent this is. We need to do something, like, now. And it's not enough to just talk about it. We need real solutions.
So let's talk solutions. Like, what can we do? What is being done? Is there any, like, good news here? Any hope?
There is. There's some amazing people, organizations out there fighting to make a difference. Disability Rights Texas, for example. They provide legal aid to families like Paul's, making sure their rights are protected and pushing for change.
Yeah, legal aid is so important, especially when it feels like, you're up against this giant system. What other organizations are out there doing good work?
The Arc of Texas is another one. They're really good at getting the word out, educating people about IDD, breaking down those stereotypes that lead to stigma and discrimination. They're giving a voice to people who often don't have one.
Yeah, changing the way people think about these issues is so important. It's not about fixing people. It's about creating a society where everyone feels welcome and valued.
Exactly. And then there's the Texas Counselor for Developmental Disabilities. They're more on the policy side, pushing for changes to the law, more funding for home and community-based services, and this is key, higher wages for DSPs.
It sounds like we need, all of the above. Advocacy, education, legislation. It's going to take all of it to make a real difference. But it's not just up to these organizations, right?
Mm-hmm.
What can everyday people like our listeners do? How can they help?
That's the question. I mean, awareness is huge. Talk to your friends and family about this. Contact your representatives. Tell them this matters. Every voice makes a difference.
Right. Turn that outrage into action, right? Empathy into advocacy. It sounds, I don't know, it can sound kind of overwhelming, but even little things can help.
They really can. Educate yourself. Support these organizations. And remember, this isn't just about helping people with disabilities. It's about building a better, more just world for everybody.
This has been, it's been a tough conversation, but it's so important to have these conversations. So to everyone listening, thank you. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Change starts with awareness, but it only happens if we do something.
Yeah.
So let's all do what we can to build a Texas where everyone has the chance to thrive.